And I'm so grateful to be here, especially since I was planning to be here 5 years ago. And those plans, along with every other plan that everyone in the world had at that time, were disrupted. But we do our best to carry on. What I want to do today is to speak about the role of Jewish followers of Jesus, Messianic Jews and Jewish Christians, in the healing of the wounded people of God. In my writings, I focus to a great extent on biblical exegesis. And if you want to know how the things that I share with you today relate to my understanding of Scripture, you'll need to turn to those writings, because I'm going to do something different today. I want to share something with you of my vision in relation to my own personal experience and my own biography. And so I want to take you through the course of my adult life. And so this is a kind of testimony, but it's a testimony to what God has done with me over these years in the different phases of my life and how it has come together in recent years. My adult life, which is really my life as a Jewish follower of Jesus, began when I was 19 years old. And I would describe the first phase as my Jewish Christian ecumenist phase. And the second period of my life as a follower of Yeshua, I would describe as my post-missionary Messianic Jewish activist phase. And the third phase, which I'm in now, in my mellow old age, could be characterized as an ecumenist for post-missionary Jewish disciples of Jesus, Messianic Jews and Jewish Christians together. So, the first phase, which encompasses the years 1971 to 1993, as I said, this is my period as a Jewish Christian ecumenist. During that period, I was serving as a leader of an ecumenical Christian community founded by Roman Catholics. It was about 2/3 Catholic, 1/3 Protestant Orthodox, and assorted miscellaneous others, including a small group of Messianic Jews. My primary concern in that first period was the unity of the body of Christ, now wounded by its multiple divisions. As I said, we were an ecumenical community, and we were trying to do something quite radical in our daily life. having Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox actually share their lives together, not just perhaps greet one another as friendly neighbors, but actually live together and serve together. It was challenging, it was difficult, but it was incredibly enriching. And in those years, my vision of the role of Jewish believers in Jesus within God's purpose for the healing of the church matured. I came to believe that the first schism, the first split within the life of the church was not the split between East and West. It was clearly not the split between Catholic and Protestant. It was the split between Jew and Gentile. And during that period, I had a friend, close friend, who gave a teaching on this, who was another leader within this ecumenical community. And I remember he came into the sanctuary. He was, back then, we actually wore suits, and ties. I've forgotten what that was about, but he had a vest. And the vest, a number of people noticed, was buttoned incorrectly. And such that there was a hole visible in the bottom of the vest. And his message was about this primal split. And at a certain point in the midst of his message, he looked down at his vest. He said, "Well, look at this vest. If you start buttoning the vest in the wrong place, the entire vest is incorrectly aligned." And he said, that's what happened in the life of the church. Something went wrong in its inner constitution from the beginning, in the relationship of Jew and Gentile. And until that issue is addressed, the church cannot hope to recover its own internal unity. He gave that message in probably the early 1980s. And in that same period, I gave a similar message at an ecumenical charismatic conference in New Orleans in the United States in 1987. Now, during this period, I was seeking at the same time to live a Jewish life. I went to a local conservative synagogue every Saturday morning for services. I began to lane, we call it in Hebrew, it's actually Yiddish, to lane tefillin, to wear phylacteries every morning as I prayed, to pray through the morning service of the traditional Jewish liturgy. I began to study Hebrew and to focus on the Hebrew of the liturgy so that I could pray through the Jewish liturgy intelligently. It was during these years, when I was part of a Christian world in many ways, when my spiritual life was getting very deeply rooted in Jewish soil. Now, my theological world, my theological life, was at that period still largely shaped by Christian concerns. But my spiritual life was primarily formed by this deep Jewish source of Jewish prayer. It hadn't yet, though, worked itself out fully into my way of understanding my faith. Everything was not yet integrated. But you know, there's a saying in Christian tradition, in Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi, which means the law of prayer is the law of faith. And so eventually that spiritual life that I was forming needed to get expressed also fully in the way I understood who Yeshua was, who God was, and what God's purposes were within the world. In those years, I called myself a Messianic Jew. But at the same time, I had no problem seeing myself also as a Christian. I would have called myself a Jewish Christian. You can still find online books that I wrote during that period. I wrote a book called, what was it called? I co-wrote a book called Emotions in the Christian Life. I wrote a little book called The Self-Image of a Christian. I had no problem identifying in that way. And for me in that phase, being a Jewish Christian was equivalent to being a Messianic Jew. And that changed as I entered into the next phase of my life. And as I said, I would characterize this phase as post-missionary, Messianic Jewish activist. In this phase, I was primarily working within the Messianic Jewish movement. I was no longer a part of this ecumenical community which had gone through major turmoil and a split. And the Messianic Jews from that community altogether formed a Messianic Jewish congregation. I also had gone back to school. That was the period in which I earned my doctoral degree from the University of Michigan. And so I was also thinking through a number of issues theologically and biblically at a level that I had not processed in that first phase of my spiritual life. In this new phase of my life, I became more deeply conscious of the essential role of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition in God's work within the world as a whole. If in my first phase, my focus was the unity of the church, in this second phase, my focus became the unity of the whole people of God, the Jewish people as a whole and the church. And I was no longer seeing Jewish followers of Jesus simply as the answer to the problem of Christian disunity. But I began to see the work, the calling of Jewish followers of Jesus as having this broader role in the healing of the entire people of God, the Jewish people as a whole and the Jewish tradition as a whole, and the church and the Christian tradition as a whole. In this phase, I entered deeply into the Messianic Jewish movement. I had had connections with leaders within the movement in those earlier years, but I was not myself deeply involved. But now I began to participate actively in the leadership of different Messianic Jewish organizations nationally and internationally. And when I entered into the Messianic Jewish movement, I experienced something of a shock. And I think the Messianic Jewish movement also experienced a bit of a shock through my presence. The shock on my end was what I sensed was that the Jewish life of much of the Messianic Jewish movement that I was encountering was very superficial. I had been, as I said, attending a traditional synagogue for, at that point, almost 20 years. I had been, while I was living within a Christian community, my spiritual life, as I said, was shaped by traditional Jewish liturgy and traditional Jewish spiritual life. And I didn't sense a great depth in that within the Messianic Jewish world. I sensed that there was still an attempt to try to figure out, how do you put this Jesus thing together with this Jewish thing? The second thing I noticed, and this was perhaps one of the most disturbing or one of the most critical things for me to see, I saw how strongly oriented the Messianic Jewish movement was to evangelism. And I also began to see how deeply entrenched the Messianic Jewish movement was within a North American evangelical world. And one of the basic premises of that North American evangelical world was that everyone who does not confess faith in Jesus is damned to hell. And many Messianic Jews held that view as well. And it impelled them to see their calling as Messianic Jews as largely an evangelistic calling. I had been part of, as I said, a community founded by Roman Catholics. And the Roman Catholic approach to this issue is very different than the evangelical one. It's still one which is very centered in the person of Jesus. There's never any compromising on the unique salvific role of Jesus. At the same time, it allows for the possibility that there are many who, for various historical and sociological reasons, do not come to a conscious knowledge of Jesus in this life. And it opens up the possibility for God's saving action in other ways. Not God's saving action apart from Jesus, but God's saving action apart from human beings' conscious awareness and confession and recognition of Jesus. I think that was very significant for me because what I experienced was a kind of mixed sense of, on the one hand, Messianic Jews affirming strongly God's election of the Jewish people and of God's purpose for the Jewish people, of an irrevocable covenant that God had with the Jewish people. And at the same time, Messianic Jews looking at every Jew in the world who hadn't come to faith in Jesus, which of course is 99 point however many % of Jews in the world, as being condemned to hell. I couldn't see how those things actually fit together. And so during this phase, I began to go much, much more deeply theologically into Jewish space. I began to study traditional Jewish sources in a way that I hadn't in my Jewish Christian phase. I came actually to a point where I no longer identified as a Jewish Christian. That was not a critique of the word Christian. It simply was a reflection of my sense that Christianity was God's way for the church of the Gentiles, but that this tradition was one which did not leave space for Jews. And my sense was Messianic Jews needed to forge our own path and to develop a tradition that was rooted in Jewish sources and Jewish perspectives, which we could only draw actually from the richness of the Jewish tradition of the last 2,000 years. In the late 1990s, I began to develop a set of relationships with other Messianic Jews, other Messianic Jewish leaders who had the same type of concerns about the Messianic Jewish movement and its limitations and weaknesses, and who wanted to strengthen it and wanted to help move it towards a greater level of maturity. And together, we came to a way of understanding what the church is in relationship to the Jewish people. It was expressed later in a term that appeared in my book, Post-missionary Messianic Judaism, in the year 2005, as bilateral ecclesiology. And the entire perspective was bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel. What does bilateral ecclesiology mean? It means that in its very essence, the church is twofold, consisting of Jews and Gentiles, and that both the Jewish life of Jewish members of this ecclesia and the life of those from the nations, which is what Gentile means, needed to be expressed in distinctive forms. And in order for this to take place, the Jewish expression of faith in Jesus needed to have corporate, institutional environments, which is basically the vision of the Messianic Jewish movement. And so, bilateral ecclesiology, the church as twofold, the church from the circumcision, the church from the nations. And then I came to think that really the term church, because of all of its connotations, was really not a word that could be applied by Jews for its expression of the ecclesia. And so, in my own language, just as I was seeing Christian as most appropriately applied to just the church of the nations, so the term church itself became something that I thought was only appropriate to be used to describe the church from the nations. And I would use the Greek Latin term, ecclesia, the underlying term that gets translated church at times, for the Jewish expression of the body of Christ, the body of the Messiah. Bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel spoke about this twofold community in which the Jewish expression was deeply rooted within the life of the Jewish people. It was not apart from the Jewish people. It wasn't in between the Jewish people and the church. It was simply within the Jewish people. And because it was within the Jewish people, when the Church of the Nations was in communion with this group, with this body of people, it was being brought into a living, organic connection to the life of the Jewish people. This is the vision that I articulated in my book in 2005 called Post-missionary Messianic Judaism. And the term post-missionary was chosen especially to capture this sense that the purpose of the Messianic Jewish community is not to be an evangelistic movement to try to get all of these Jews to become Christians. And that, in fact, Messianic Jews were supposed to live in such a way that we were simply unveiling the reality of the presence of the Messiah in the very midst and heart of the life of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition through history. That he was already there. We didn't need to bring him there. He was already there. We were simply to live in a way that made that visible, that was a sign of that underlying reality that already existed. Now, this was a rather controversial notion. And that's part of the reason I described myself during this period as an activist. I was stirring up trouble. But it wasn't just me. I was really simply expressing in that book the vision that a number of my colleagues had come to. And in many ways, that publication of 2005 was the end of the second phase of my journey, and the beginning of the third phase. In this third phase, what I began to experience was a bringing together of the first two. As I said, in that first phase, I was a Jewish Christian ecumenist operating within the life of the church. Very much rooted in my Jewish identity, but seeing that identity primarily in relationship to the inner life of the church. In the second phase, I was trying to reorient my Jewish identity so that it wasn't something internal to the church, but something that was internal to the Jewish people. And in this last phase, what I've been seeing is the need for both of these realities, and somehow for them to be brought together. And as you'll see, this didn't come about simply through an intellectual process. It wasn't a matter of me simply sitting in my study and developing a set of syllogisms, logical steps that takes me A leads to B, which leads to C, and I've thought this through, okay, now I see where it all goes. It wasn't like that at all. Nothing in my life has been like that at all, and I don't think anything in most of our lives is that way. I was led through a set of events and circumstances that enabled me to see things that I simply hadn't seen before. The main event that set me on this new course occurred in 2008, and appropriately enough, it was in the context of a lecture I was giving in Jerusalem about the book Post-missionary Messianic Judaism, and about the response that the book had generated in the previous 3 years. I gave this lecture, which was actually in the Baptist house in Jerusalem, and after the lecture concluded, a man came up to me to talk to me, and he introduced himself as a Jewish Catholic priest and theologian of the Dominican order from France. His name was Antoine Levy. And he said that he had been thinking about these kinds of issues, the sort of issues that I was covering, and that he wanted to pursue a conversation with me about these things. I found it very intriguing, and we set up a time to have lunch together that week. We met together, and I encountered someone who really was different than anyone I had ever met before. My previous experience had been that when Jews became Catholics, or Jews became Protestants, when Jews entered into the life of a Christian church, their Jewish identity eventually would be compromised in some way, and they would become assimilated, and eventually, in their own consciousness, their sense of being Jewish would evaporate. But here was someone whose Jewish identity was formidable. It was strong. It was deeply rooted. And he was someone who was wrestling with his Jewish identity and wrestling with the need for Jewish identity to be expressed within the life of the church. I was a little skeptical about whether anything like this could possibly happen, but we agreed to continue our conversation, and during that year we corresponded a good bit, and we met in Jerusalem a year later to spend a couple of days together and talk more. And from that meeting came a conference that the two of us decided to put together in Helsinki in the year 2010. A conference that would bring together a set of Jewish followers of Jesus who were Messianic Jews and Jews from the world of the churches. And we would together wrestle with these basic questions about Jewish identity and faith in Jesus. Again, I was rather skeptical about whether we could pull this off, and even if we did, whether ultimately we could find enough commonality to do anything together. But Antoine was right, and my skepticism was not justified. We did this conference, we developed a common statement together, this group of about 10 to 15 of us, and we decided we need to continue this conversation. And so we developed this fellowship of sorts of scholars that was called the Helsinki Consultation on Jewish Continuity in the Body of the Messiah. We met every year, every summer, at a different site in Europe. And I believe it was in 2014, we met in the Netherlands and met at the University of Ede, where we'll be having a session tomorrow. That's also where I met Jeroen Bol for the first time. As a result of all of these meetings, which continued on all the way to about 2017, our final meeting took place in Krakow, and the previous year we had actually met in Moscow. We decided the time had come for us to try to bring together an ecumenical fellowship of Jewish believers in Jesus. And so we gathered a group of about 45 together in Dallas in the United States in 2018. And from that, a fellowship emerged called Yachad BeYeshua, together in Jesus. A fellowship of Messianic Jews and Jews from the churches, seeking to deepen our bonds of love and appreciation and respect with one another, and to be a sign of what God desired for his people as a whole, both internally to the life of the church, of the followers of Jesus, and more broadly, the relationship of the Jewish people as a whole and the church. You can see how what was happening was a bringing together of that vision that I had as a Jewish Christian ecumenist and my vision as a post-missionary Messianic Jewish activist. My perspective on this broadening of vision was first articulated in an article that I wrote in 2011, and which is now included in my most recent book called Stones the Builders Rejected. It was an article that I both gave in a Messianic Jewish conference, and then a little later I presented another version of it at a meeting of the Helsinki Consultation in Europe. The paper was called "The Community of Jewish Disciples of Jesus, Standing and Serving as a Priestly Remnant." In that piece, I looked at 3 apostles as types or representative figures of 3 different expressions of the vocation of Jewish disciples of Jesus. The 3 apostles were James, the brother of Yeshua, Peter, and Paul. James represented the Jewish follower of Jesus who is immersed in the heart of Jewish life. James, living in Jerusalem, absorbed in the inner life of the Jewish people at its very heart. Connecting the Jesus movement in this way to the Jewish people as a whole. So, James represented those Messianic Jews who were like me in that second phase of my life. Those who were seeking simply to be part of the Jewish people and the Jewish world. And then you have Paul, on the other hand, immersed in the heart of the Gentile world, adapting to that world, but never forgetting his Jewish identity. We see this, of course, especially within the book of Acts, the picture of Paul. He's still living as a Jew, but he has to make certain kinds of practical adaptations because of his calling as an apostle to the nations of the world. His vocation was to be a Jew in the midst of the Gentiles. That was my vocation in the first phase of my life as a follower of Yeshua, as a Jewish Christian ecumenist. And then we have the figure of Peter. And of course, Peter, on the one hand, in the book of Acts, he's the one representing the apostles and speaking and preaching to the city of Jerusalem. But then he's also the one who is speaking to Cornelius. Peter is that Jewish apostle who, in a sense, is there to unite the whole, to bring both sides together, to link Paul and James. And we get a sense, like in the book of Galatians, in the tensions between Peter and Paul, how it wasn't very easy for Peter to fulfill that task. But we see this, I think, as something that's an ongoing vocation. There are some Jewish followers of Jesus who are called to express their identity as Jews and as followers of Jesus through both being connected and rooted in the Jewish people and also having a special link to the life of the church, and thereby kind of bringing these things together. And what I began to see was really where I was being led in this last phase was more of a Peter type calling. But I had started as a Paul and then had gone and been a James, and now I was a Peter. In the 2011 article, I emphasized that Jewish followers of Yeshua as a priestly remnant are supposed to represent the Jewish people in relationship to the church, but that we are called to represent and not replace. We are not a substitute for the church engaging with the Jewish people directly. But there are certain ways that we are able to be in relationship with the church and open up certain realities and perspectives that would be more difficult to be communicated by those who are not followers of Yeshua, but are within the Jewish people and are seeking themselves positive relationships with the life of the church. In this view, Messianic Jews, whether we've got a James calling or a Paul calling or a Peter calling, we do not exist for ourselves. We're not the true Jews, the real Jews, the good Jews, the saved Jews. We're also not the true church. We are not the restored first century church, so that everyone has to come to us and learn from us in order to find out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We are a sign. We are a sign of something that is not us. It's the wholeness of the people of God, the Jewish people and the church, which belong together, belong to be in fellowship with one another. That's God's purpose. It's not us. We are meant to be a visible sign of God's purpose for his people. And I want to conclude now and just say that in this perspective, the Jewish people as a whole and the church as a whole in all of its parts together are called to be witnesses in the world to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the Father of Jesus the Messiah, in a world which has so little hope, so little sense of purpose and direction, which looks forward to a century which looks to only get more difficult, with more problems and more challenges on the horizon, where some young people decide to not have children just because they don't want to bring children into the world to face what they'll need to face. In that world, the people of God needs to be a people that has a strong sense of hope and of vision and of purpose, that God is real, that God works in history. And when we want to see a sign of God's working in history, where else to look than in the life of the Jewish people who have encountered the greatest sufferings, the greatest obstacles, the greatest threats, and somehow managed to come through and affirm life and give birth to children who will face difficult futures. Even for Jews who don't consciously know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there's this almost instinctive sense of affirming life and hope and a future. The Jewish people are a sign and a witness to God. And the church, which hopes in the one who raised Jesus from the dead, who believes that he is the God of history, who will bring all things to completion in his own sovereign purposes. The church needs to also be a people of hope. But I think it's only together, when the church and the Jewish people find one another as partners together, that we can truly be the sign of hope that this world badly needs, so badly needs. When the wounded people of God, the broken and fragmented people of God, can once again recognize one another as brothers and sisters and together be witnesses to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Father of Messiah, Jesus, the one who brought Israel out of Egypt and the one who raised Jesus from the dead. Thank you. I think that there's a time for some questions and comments. So, Robert, would you
Sure.
moderate this, please?
Sure, I will. So if there are questions, remarks, now is the time to put them on the table, to ask them to Mark. Whether he will answer them right away, that's another thing. Mm-hmm. Maybe issues for discussion even. We have time for that, so don't hesitate. And we always use the microphone, yes, so that we all can hear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I heard about this Towards Jerusalem Council 2. Can you tell us more about some next steps? About, maybe not everyone knows it, and what are the next steps which are going to take?
Yes, this initiative towards Jerusalem Council 2 began in 1996 and has been going now for these several decades. And it is an attempt to alert the church as a whole to the significance of the Messianic Jewish movement and to have a kind of response from the church as a whole that corresponds to what the Council of Jerusalem, spoken of in Acts chapter 15, what the Council of Jerusalem did for Gentiles in the life of the church. That there needs to be a clear expression of commitment to support Jewish identity within the life of the body of the Messiah. And those involved in Toward Jerusalem Council 2, it operates on a number of levels, on levels of prayer and levels of connecting up with church leaders. I'm not on the board or directly involved with Toward Jerusalem Council 2, but at times I've been a theological advisor and am certainly very supportive of their work. And I'm wondering, Edjon, would you like to say anything more? Edjon Westerman, who will be also speaking today, is been involved in Toward Jerusalem Council 2 more closely. And it might be good for you to say something about
it. Well, the circles connect the the perspectives and the content of what Mark shared meet each other with the Toward Jerusalem Council 2 movement within different continents. They met very recently, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago already now, 2.5 years ago in Vienna. And there one could see that a theological thinking directed towards understanding, reconciliation, and steps need to be taken in the policy of the churches in the whole of Europe and also elsewhere. There, one could see that these two circles, these two spheres of movements are bringing fruit to each other. And within the Netherlands, the conference in Vienna has had already a lot of network contacts and other things that are really happening. So, but when you would like to know more about TJC2, there are people here around, and me too also, who can give some more information. But it's supportive, both Mark and everything he told, and TJC2, they are supportive to each other, and so that's just a bit.
Thank you, Etienne.
Thank you, Etienne. There's a question over there.
Thank you for letting us show the journey you have made in your life. And during the listening to you, I thought, what would have happened if you would get stuck in the first phase? Can you expand on that?
Yes, yes. Well, I think part of being in this third phase means that I've now developed close relationships with people who are living their life within the Christian spaces, but who have a strong sense of Jewish identity. And so I can see in them what I could have become. Antoine Levy is a good illustration of that, although I was not a Catholic and was never entertaining becoming a Catholic. Another figure of a leader in Yachad BeYeshua who has become a close friend of mine is a man by the name of Lee Spitzer. Lee was the general secretary of the American Baptists in the United States. And he retired from that, and he did a doctorate in history here in the Netherlands under Henk Bakker, and he became he's the official historian of the World Baptist Alliance. And he's Jewish and has a very strong sense of Jewish identity. And I met him for the first time at this Dallas meeting in 2018, and it's hard for me to believe now that I've only known him for 7 years, because he feels like I feel like I've known him my whole life. And it's interesting because Lee, he wrote an article that was a response to this 2011 piece that I had in that was called what was it called again? It was called "The Community of Jewish Disciples of Jesus, Standing and Serving as a Priestly Remnant." Well, Lee's response was he very clearly himself identified with Paul, with the Paul calling of Jewish identity. And what he wanted to do was push to emphasize how essential that calling was. And he argued that we should understand Jewish disciples of Jesus as kind of like two sides of a bridge, or two gates, with the Messianic Jews on the Jewish side and the Jewish Christians on the church side. But both then, when we linked with one another, together then we became a more adequate bridge between the Jewish people and the life of the church. And I learned from that piece and thought that Lee is right here. And so when I look at people like Antoine and Lee, I say, well, if I had simply continued on that path, I still could have made a contribution. I still could have lived as a Jew. It's not like the only way to live as a Jewish follower of Jesus is the way I have ultimately come through this particular path in the Messianic Jewish movement. But that I think these are not just all legitimate, but really all necessary. That we need one another. Jewish disciples of Jesus need one another. And that the church needs not only a Messianic Jewish movement that's like a body where the church looks at it and sees something different from itself, that's outside itself, but that it can talk with. It also needs some Jews who are really within it and who are kind of pushing and expressing in ways that maybe are easier for Christians to understand, right within a parish, right within a congregation, and to manifest Jewish identity in that way. So I think we all need one another, and that was a path I could have taken.
Thank you very much for provoking some thoughts. A remnant of priests, not as Levites, but as Kohanim. He has made us people of Kohanim, Jews and non-Jews. And even not from only the tribe of Levi, but from all the tribes, there will be Kohanim. Yeah. So he is the creator of Israel. He is the creator of a holy people, of a people of Kohanim, a kingdom. That's our identity, Jew and non-Jew. And still there is some difference. But how do you experience, how do you live your being a Kohanim? Together we have boldness to enter because the veil has been broken, and he brings us. We have boldness to come nearer. But what's the difference between Jew and non-Jew in that process?
Well, in many ways, that's certainly the burden of all of everything I've ever written, and yet my sense is whatever I've ever written is just touching the skin, the surface, and that there's so much more here to grasp, to understand. I think priestly identity is something that has many different types of levels and expressions. And one can think about the people of Israel as a whole, in that in Exodus 19, it's Israel as a whole that's called Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, and then Goy Kadosh, a holy nation, so that the priestly holiness that God gives is not simply to the priestly tribe, it's really to Israel as a whole. And yet, you have the tribe of Levi that has this very particular service and vocation within the priestly nation. So a priestly tribe within a priestly nation, and then within the tribe of Levi, there's one family, the descendants of Aaron, and they are the Kohanim, and they have another particular type of priestly vocation within the priestly tribe, within the priestly nation. So the point is, I think, that you can have an overall priestly identity and calling, and then have it be differentiated, to have various ways in which different parts of a priestly community are called to express and serve within that. And that's really what the nature of this distinction of Jew and Gentile is about. Each side has its own priestly identity, but that those identities are different. And in part, they're different because each side is representing different bodies of people and that have their own particular vocation in the world. There is that amazing passage in Isaiah 66, where God brings out these priests from the nations. But I think it's very significant. They are priests from the nations, meaning they are serving a special priestly role in relationship to their nations that they've come from. And just as the descendants of Aaron are serving a kind of a priestly role in relationship to the Jewish people, and where I think the Jewish disciples of Yeshua, as those who are like standing in this gap, have this particular kind of priestly role as followers of Yeshua, being brought into Yeshua's particular priesthood. In ultimately, of course, his priesthood is the core of all priesthoods. And in this particular paper in which I spoke of this, the main emphasis I had was on how Jewish disciples of Yeshua are supposed to have a sense of identification with the Jewish people as a whole in such a way that we bring the Jewish people before God and stand before God on behalf of the people as a whole. And that, again, we are not the replacement. And that phrase, priestly remnant, it's the phrase that was so significant, in that Paul uses the notion of remnant in Romans 11 when he's speaking about Jewish disciples of Jesus. He speaks about us as the remnant. But sometimes we can think about remnant as though the remnant is the true reality, that what it means is everyone else perishes and the remnant continues on, and then God builds the new nation out of the remnant. That is one perspective on remnant. By adding the term priestly to the phrase, to say a priestly remnant, what it's conveying is the sense that Paul was not thinking about this remnant as a remnant that replaces, because he also talks about the batch of dough that are the first fruits that contribute to the sanctification of the whole, and uses that as an image probably also for the Jewish disciples of Yeshua. And so he's thinking of a remnant that's representing the whole and not replacing the whole. And so whether, I think the critical thing is more than understanding I think priests fundamentally are always standing before God to bring blessing to those that they represent. And then the key thing is knowing who you represent and in what context. And that ends up being the critical part of the outworking of a particular priestly service. So those are just a few comments on this.
I have 3 last questions. You're the second, you're the first, you're the third. But 3 questions means short questions and brief answers.
I have a question with regards to the Jews who believe in Jesus but want to remain part of Jewish life, like the James, those who feel called to be James. What do you see happening with this group? To what extent are they accepted within Judaism? To what extent can they continue to visit normal synagogues? How do religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, look at Jews who believe in Jesus? Is there maybe a little bit more reconciliation between religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, and Jews who believe in Jesus, so that they begin to see that Jews who believe in Jesus can remain and do remain Jewish?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I myself have continued to participate in the local conservative synagogue so I've now been associated with them for 50 years. I participate when I'm home in a daily online minyan service that is part of the conservative synagogue. And actually, I know now an increasing number of Messianic Jews who are not part of Messianic Jewish congregations, but who are part of traditional synagogues. If anything, I think it's a growing phenomenon, and that needs to be really taken account of. As to our recognition or how we're seen and understood, I think there's no way of quantifying this or of saying for sure how, is it changing? Are the attitudes changing? I think they are. I see myself a difference from previous decades, but the changes are very slow. And we shouldn't expect some kind of major breakthrough in the next few years where leaders in the wider Jewish world are suddenly, embracing and welcoming publicly Messianic Jews. But the reality is many rabbis these days, they know there are Jewish followers of Jesus in their midst, and they are quietly okay with that.
I think you mentioned that Messianic Jews bridging between the first and then the second part of it, right? And do you also see that the Christian traditions give up some of their theological views, where that creates the room or moving towards a bit more Jewish way of thinking, right, happening in the near future?
Yes, I do. And again, just as in my answer to the other question, the changes we're talking about are massive. This process of the issues we're wrestling with here goes so deep in the life of Christians, just as these issues also go so deep in the life of Jews. To bring about basic change here in a way that is expressed in every normal congregation and parish, I think it's still a long ways into the future. I don't think I will see it in my lifetime. But what I see, though, is really extraordinary change. We simply have to have a historical perspective on how massive these changes are, and therefore how long they will take to. If we are impatient about this, I think we will quickly get discouraged. We need a long-range perspective on this. But I see something happening here that is really amazing. I mean, I've been involved in conversations with leaders within the Catholic Church on these matters for 25 years. And there's been dramatic change. But it still hasn't filtered down into the life of a normal Catholic parish. You know, this is like a huge boat that you're trying to change course, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen quickly. But again, I want to encourage us, at least from the angle of vision that I have, the nature of the changes that are taking place are really extraordinary. But we have to be patient.
Thank you. Last question, Peter.
When I understood you well, you said we don't have to bring Jesus to the Jews, to the Jewish people, because Jesus is already there. Can you explain what you mean by that? And can you give examples from the Bible and other examples?
Well, I think in terms of from the Bible, the clearest expression is simply the several texts which speak about the presence of Jesus in the midst of Israel before the incarnation. You know, thinking about Paul saying, you know, the rock was Christ. You know, for anyone who at least holds a Trinitarian understanding of God, if one says God is with the Jewish people, then Jesus is with the Jewish people. You don't have God without Jesus. We often don't think this through, you know, in terms of what the inevitable conclusions are. But it's one way or the other. If God is still in the midst of Israel, then Jesus is in the midst of Israel. In terms of examples, I could give many, many examples, though, from my own experience, whether it be purely on the level of my encounter with Jesus in the midst of synagogue worship, or seeing different ways in which Jewish teaching or Jewish liturgy or the order of selection of texts in the Jewish lectionary actually come together to bear witness to the person of Jesus. You know, what I propose is that Jesus is the King of the Jews who has been actually shaping and involved in the shaping and directing the life of the Jewish people in a hidden way, like Joseph in the midst of Egypt. And that the Joseph story should be critical for our way of understanding Jesus in the midst of Jewish history and in our own day.